Good afternoon, it is from the UK. It may be a different time of the day wherever you are. My name is Graeme Atherton. I'm Vice Principal at Ruskin College, Oxford, but also, in the purpose of this initiative, Director of the World Access to Higher Education Network, or WAHEN. And wonderful to welcome you all to this first WAHEN Global Communities Seminar, Inequalities in Access and Success in Higher Education. What does research and data show? And this is a really great opportunity to bring together some key speakers from across the world, as well as a truly global audience, to examine what is a crucial issue in the context of the global higher education sector at present. What I'm going to do in a moment is just tell you a little bit more about WAHEN and the World Access to Education Network and the work that we're doing for getting into the seminar. Today on our programme we have Andreas Schleicher from the OECD, Kristina Hauschildt from EUROSTUDENT, and myself as well, talking a little bit about our WAHEN work. So opportunities as well for questions and discussion. So I encourage everybody from the outset, when we do start our presentations, to think of your questions and to post them in the chat and have a discussion and debate. And we have got some time for discussion and questions. So please get your questions in there, be thinking about them when our presenters are speaking. Before we begin and get into really the topics of the seminar, a little bit more about WAHEN and our global communities. Francis sharing the slides there. So the World Access to Education Network was launched formally in December last year, a hybrid event, both from the University of Oxford and online. WAHEN's goal is to form a network across the world, bringing together universities, charitable organisations, foundations, employers and others, focused on equitable access and success in higher education. WAHEN has a history. Some of you in the call today will remember that for 5 years, from 2018 to 2022, we here in the UK, through the National Education Opportunities Network, or NEON, the organisation I used to lead, led something called World Access to Education Day, which ran for 5 years. WAHEN was a successful initiative where we had an international day of action. We brought together organisations across the world delivering activities, seminars, discussions, and initiatives under the WAHEN banner, as well as in the later year part of WAHEN's history. We had a number of online conferences across the world. However, we felt that after 2022, the need for something more significant here. In what truly is we always say that it's a challenging time for equity in higher education in terms of the inequalities that are pervasive across the world where access is concerned by social background to higher education. I'm sure that will come through in our discussions today. But those challenges are never perhaps more pronounced than they are at the moment. Therefore, the need for WAHEN, we argue, has been never more so than it is at the moment. Move on to the next slide then, Francis. So what will WAHEN do? We'll have a number of elements. We will bring in WAHEN back this year, and those of you who are subscribed to the WAHEN Bulletin will know that in late October this year, we will have a return for the World Access to Higher Education Day, where again there'll be opportunities for people to lead initiatives and take activity under the WAHEN banner, wherever they are, in their own localities, their own universities, their own regions, their own schools, colleges, etc. We'll undertake research and advocacy, very much taking forward the data agenda in this area. We will implement and instigate capacity building work. Crucial that we build a community of those who are both committed to doing this work as both a part of their roles or as all of their roles. We build those collaborations across the world. Well, we see different challenges across the world when it comes to higher education access and equity and success. There are still many commonalities in terms of these challenges, opportunities for exchange. We will see a couple of slides ago, you'll see our new website, which I'm sure some of you have visited. On there already, we have 40 plus examples of initiatives across the world focused on equitable access and success in higher education. That kind of knowledge sharing is crucial to how the network goes forward. Those providing opportunities for convening as well. To the next slide, well, Francis. This initiative today, this activity today, is part of our new WAHEN Global Communities series. But the aim is to bring together and share knowledge and practice on different themes within the equitable access and success space. These themes will include research and data we're looking at today, understanding policy approaches, university leadership, and access initiatives to support access and success. And that'll be our next global community events coming up in June. These global communities will not just be one-off events. We want to put regular activities together, regular online opportunities for exchange of knowledge and practice. While they begin with very much a presentation-based format, we tend to move to more interactive, discursive, and exchange discussion-based format as global communities grow, particularly into 2026, where formal membership for WAHEN will be launched. See you next slide then, Francis. So for January 2026, organisations will be able to join WAHEN, participating in shaping its work and advancing our shared and collective goals. And very much as in all true networks, we look at a collaborative exercise. We've taken initiative to take WAHEN forward here with our partners and our board, including the World Bank, UNESCO, Asia Europe Foundation, and several universities across the world. But going forth, the success and impact of what we do will be done by collective exchange and working together to take this crucial goal forward. So as a background to WAHEN, what we're trying to do here, let's focus now on a particular focus of today's seminar and our first launch of our first Global Communities event. It's a great pleasure to turn to our first speaker now, Andreas Schleicher. So those of you who have not heard Andreas, so many of you will have heard Andreas speak before. He's Director for Education and Skills, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development at OECD. Initiated and oversees the Programme for International Student Assessment of PISA, as well as other international instruments, creating a global platform for exchange of knowledge and transforming educational policy and practice. Andreas is a very well-known speaker, as well as a very strong advocate of many of the things we take forward in WAHEN. Andreas, thank you for finding time in your busy schedule to present our event today. I hand the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to join you here. And I do believe the objectives that you pursue at WAHEN are so important in the times in which we live, in which, on the one hand, we see a larger number of people going to higher education, and at the very same time, actually, some forms of inequality widening. But let me share a couple of slides with you. I think you should see them now. And I want to start with, the kind of positive picture. You can see overall the share of older people or people 25 to 34-year-olds with either, higher education or an equivalent vocational education rising constantly across countries. And when you look at, the share of adults 25 to 34 with a tertiary education by country, you can also see how this plays out in different countries. Basically, in every country, you see remarkably progress over the last decade in the share of people completing higher education. More people going, and some people suspected, well, one day everybody will have a college degree and work for the minimum wage. But actually, our data also show that the earnings outcomes have actually not diminished. In many cases, they've actually increased. So the impact of education on social and economic outcomes has become stronger in many ways. At the very same time, you can see also when you ask yourself who gets tertiary qualifications, that, for example, the attainment of migrants is still highly variable across countries. We see that for people not completing high school, we see that for high school graduates, but actually also for tertiary education. You can see there are some countries, like New Zealand or Australia, that have, to some extent, the UK, that have built strategies around attracting foreign students into their countries and also migrant students, where you can say that's a very large share of people. But in many countries, you can see the share of migrant students is actually quite small, sometimes even smaller than the migrant population in the relevant age group. So this is one example of groups that often lose out when it comes to getting access to higher education. When you look at money, it's always an important perspective. You can see the share of expenditure when you add, public money, private money, international funds on universities and other tertiary institutions. as a share of national income, now that's the only way to compare that meaningfully, you can see it's been roughly constant. And basically, often that has put pressure on unit costs. And when there's pressure on unit costs, it again often hits the most marginalized students first. On the benefit side, you can see that the financial returns on getting a degree are very significant, very large in some countries, a little bit higher for men than for women. But you look to countries like the United States, where you talk about $700,000 in purchasing power parities for a man completing a university education or equivalent vocational degree, as opposed to someone who just has a high school degree. There are other countries where that looks smaller. You can see Sweden, and it doesn't necessarily say something negative about higher education. You need to look at, tax systems and all sorts of mechanisms that may diminish the returns on education. And but there is significant variability in the economic outcomes. But, and this is again the point that relates to equality. When you look on the positive side, you can see the share of tertiary educated workers who earn more than twice the median. Now, you can see that can be very significant in some countries. So you can see at the same time, the share of adults who earn half the medium if they have not completed high school is also very significant. And these bars have been growing over time. What this means is that we are seeing a growing trend towards polarization. Even if access to higher education would not become, more polarized or, more socially inequitable, the consequences of differences are rising. Now, on the one hand, those who have, a great education never had the life chances they have today in terms of economic outcomes, while those who lose out in education actually see diminishing kind of wages. So not necessarily employment, but certainly wages. That is something why, equitable access to higher education should concern us. If we do not get that right, we see that translating more and more into inequalities in our societies, in our economies. In the past, we also had inequalities, but they did not matter as much as they do today. I think that's a really, really important point, answering the question of why we should care about the agenda of WAHEN. And here you can see, just a few countries where that polarization is particularly strongly visible. So that brings me to the question, how do we mediate inequalities in access to higher education? There are lots of things at play. How do you get access? To what extent do we balance merit-based access with needs-based access and things like this? And one measure that is useful is to look at tuition fee levels and systems that provide tuition. And you can see how much that varies across education systems. You have, the United States, and I'm just talking about, public institutions. I'm not, private institutions in the United States. I couldn't put on a map here. But you can see actually, particularly when you look at master's degree programs, you are talking about a very significant sum of money. On the right hand side, you can see countries that do not charge tuition, but that also is not necessarily a guarantee to equitable access. Often, when there is no public money, when there is no tuition, universities have very little money, can offer few places, often not at the greatest quality. And what that typically means when access is constrained, those who come from privileged backgrounds will get, the scarce public money for their own education systems. There are plenty of examples where actually, having no tuition has actually been a driver of inequalities rather than equity. Now, I think that's something really, really important to keep in mind. I already mentioned the United States as a coin. You can look Sweden, which has no tuition as the other part of the equation. And the big question is, how do we support that? And when there is tuition, to what extent do young people receive financial support? And there are different ways how you can do that. You can give, students public grants or scholarships or, government guaranteed private loans. Now that's a mix. You can give them just public grants or just, public or government guaranteed private loans. And then this plays out in different ways across different countries. Just let me highlight a few examples. You take, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland. These are the lucky students. If you watched carefully the previous chart, these are all countries that do not charge any tuition and still provide plenty of support for students, as largely to cover living costs now. So what you can see here in these countries, there is an active policy to enable as many young people as possible to go to higher education, even if it means covering their living costs. So those are the lucky students. They do not pay tuition. They still get support. And generally, you can say in those countries, access to higher education is quite equitable. How can they afford it? Well, it brings me back to an earlier chart where I showed, the earnings return is quite small. These are countries that have progressive tax systems. So later on, basically, people with better education and greater salaries end up paying more taxes, and that then repays the system. You can almost call it a kind of graduate tax system, but it's going to all high wage earners. But it's a system that has worked for the country well. There's big social investment in advanced education. Everybody pays that back in terms of taxes, and it works for everyone. You have another group of countries, Australia, New Zealand, US, Lithuania, or England, where there is very little public money going, or relatively little public money going into higher education, high levels of tuition, but also good public support. In the case of England, it's a government guaranteed loan system combined with means tested grants. People get access and then they repay whatever their tuition was later in life. It's another form of graduate tax, but more focused on the degree holder. And in most of these countries, it works well, and some more so, and others less so. When the loans are, just bank loans, not government guaranteed, like in the United States, for a large share of young people, it's more risky because even though the repayment works out on average, or the high earnings work out on average, there is a large distribution. And we need to somehow contain that risks, and that works better in systems with income contingent loan systems than in systems that have just bank guaranteed loans, where people may just say, well, I take a big loan and then I do not know whether I'm going to earn the big differential to pay back for this. And in fact, there's a large number of young people that currently have difficulties doing that. So that's the second group of countries. And then there's a third group of countries where you can see very little in terms of tuition and relatively little in terms of, public support. Again, I already highlighted, sometimes it means low spending per student, that translates into poorer quality. Sometimes it means poorer access. So I'm not advocating, that having, low levels of tuition is generally guaranteeing more equitable access. It does so when it comes together with an adequate level of overall financing. And I think that's the key, really, that you can see here. Now, to whom does the financial support go? And I think this is one of the most concerning charts, because I want to focus you on the red part, on the dark red part. Really, the indirect, the subsidies that go to students most in need, basically. They are basically contingent on social background. And you can see in most countries that's not the case. Most countries have not yet figured out to target financial support to those who are most in need. In most cases, it goes, in more general forms to subsidies for social and, other kinds of support, but not specifically target for those who are from disadvantaged backgrounds. I think these are areas where most education systems can do better to make sure that if there is little public money, that it gets more directly, targeted on those who have the biggest needs. That was, my point on the financing. I just want to, also highlight that, education is not everything. In most countries, you can see that people who have a college degree have better skill levels when we test those skills than people who have not completed school or high school. But there's also lots of variability. You can see, for example, a country like Finland, where high school graduates do better on our adult skills tests than college graduates in other countries. So sometimes, a degree is not a guarantee for high levels of skills. And again, that is what matters in terms of labor market outcomes. If you pay high levels of tuition, you do not get a relevant education, then sort of those returns may be quite diminished. We can ask ourselves, to what extent is a strong performance on an adult skills test an indicator of a, great high school system or the value add that comes through tertiary education. You can find countries all over the place. You can find countries where, high school graduates get a very good education, but then actually university at great expense adds relatively little. And you see other countries where school people come out so from school and then get a huge boost when they go into higher education. And again, that tells you a big story about, the value add provision and the question of who pays. Very last point, really looking at the outcomes of investment in skills. You saw an aggregate picture also earlier. Here you see that in a little bit more nuanced version. You can see on the one hand, the years of education in most countries, staying longer in education is good for labor force participation, but actually in many countries, the direct measures of skills that we have are better predictors. So basically that means, we shouldn't just look at university, we should look at almost any way of acquisition of high-level advanced skills because later in life, they are actually good predictor for employment outcomes. Sometimes, people have only one choice, going to college, going to university, and as you can see here, that is not necessarily the best guarantee to get, the right position for labor force participation. Now, it's the same when you look at earnings. No? You can also see here that both level of education, length of education, and directly measured skills have independent and additional effects on earnings. So on the one hand, where you studied, how long you studied, but then also what you know and can do, or both make a difference. And that again argues for a kind of open systems where people have a degree of ownership over what they learn and how they learn and where they learn and maybe even when in their lives they learn. What's interesting is if you look at the relative importance, we measured that a decade ago and just recently, and you can see in most countries the red bars are longer than the blue and green bars. Basically, the polarization, this is exactly what I highlighted before. Nowadays, both education and skills matter much more in terms of explaining your wage than was the case the decade ago. No? So once again, even if inequalities in access to higher education haven't risen, the consequences in polarizing the income distribution are clearly more pronounced than they were a decade ago when we did the survey first. It's not just about money. We can see, better, more advanced skills and more higher education are both linked to people being happy with their lives. Whether this is a direct effect or indirect effect, not being able to get an advanced education also has implications for social outcomes beyond education. That's really all. I think I've exhausted also my time and look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Andreas. Thank you. So excellent presentation there. Excellent presentation and so much to discuss, I think, going forward, both in terms of access and equity and success, but also the broader nature of higher education systems and also tertiary education systems. Let's have a look in the chat now. I mean, as I said before, please, if you have questions, we only have 15 minutes or so please get them out now if you have them. We have one initial question from Diana. Diana says, I think it's a clarification question, which is anything else, but we could expand upon it. Diana says, is it correct that OECD tertiary education includes both theoretical programs leading to advanced research or high skills professions such as medicine, and more vocational programs leading to the labour market?
That's correct. But all at the same level. When we talk about, many vocational programs are provided at secondary level, so ISKID 4, and 5. But we actually, when we talk about tertiary education, only look at vocational programs that have the same level of education of advanced skills than college degrees. So that's an important caveat here. But yes, we do look at programs of both, more applied and more theoretical nature.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So any more questions? Let's put them through the chat for Andreas. I think one question I did have picked up on the issue of targeted subsidies on one of your slides when you
Mhm.
mentioned that few countries are able to target their support for particular groups of learners. So I'd like to tell us a bit more about that. Why do you think that's the case? Is it a lack of data? Do they not know that which of the students may be eligible for such support? Is it implementation? Is it policy issues? A policy decision? What's your opinion on this one, Andreas?
It's an interesting question, and I think it's in a way a disappointing finding. If we have
Mm,
limited public subsidies, we should make them available to those who need them most. And we do that regularly in schools. In school, it's quite common that the money that students get and schools get is contingent on their
mm,
socioeconomic context in which they grow up. In university, it gets harder to measure. I think that's certainly one aspect, but I
mm,
think there could be many metrics that we could be using for that, and we simply don't. Most of the funding approaches are, not sensitive to
mm.
neither geography nor social background, and I do think that's something that in funding education, certainly there's room for improvement. As lack of data, I agree with that, but
Mm,
even within existing data systems, we should be doing better.
mm. It's interesting as well. I think we've again, if we I mentioned the WAHEN website before, we have some case study examples of institutions being able to do that at an institutional level. So clearly, there is the mechanisms to do that. Whether that can be expanded up to a whole country level or not, but I guess that there are kind of individual highlights of practice here, but not so systemic. Would you agree?
Mhm. Absolutely. I think again, I think what you say is just highlighting that it is technically possible. And again, we do that regularly in schools,
We
but
do,
we
yeah.
don't have a culture and the mechanisms yet to do that in many countries in very systematic ways. No?
Mm, exactly. Yeah, another thing I wanted to pick up on with you was when you mentioned at the end the importance of education and skills broadly and how that's increased over the last 10 years. Have you any reflections on why you think that's the case and indeed where you expect things to go? Do you expect that trend to continue? So I know in terms of the data collected, you will be obviously doing another survey into the future. When you do that, do you expect this importance of education and skill to continue? And why do you think it has increased in the last decade or
Well,
so?
it's to some extent, it's simply the skills bias polarization of labor markets.
Mm, mm,
Do you have jobs
mm,
that, are very good in extracting value from the skills of people? That's where people make money. That's actually where, productivity comes from. So I think that is part of the story. Another part is that, employers simply get better in understanding the skills potential, looking beyond, degrees
mm,
and qualification. I think we have better diagnosis. Flexibility in labor market plays a role. If you have a labor
mm,
market that is really good at getting you to work at a
mm,
place where you're more productive, you're likely to see
mm,
that, increasing rather than, labor markets that are very rigid and very silent and so on. So yeah, and I think there's no reason for us not to see that path continue,
mm, mm,
particularly when you factor in technology, artificial
mm,
intelligence. I
mm,
think
mm,
employment may not be so much affected. There are lots of jobs available for low skilled, but they
mm,
pay you less and less. So I think
mm,
if you look at
mm,
the financial returns, I would expect that the more people are skilled, the more that's going to play
mm,
into that advantage. And it should worry us because
mm,
economic polarization will translate into
mm,
social polarization, political polarization. These things are all linked now.
mm. No, I must admit, I think the most striking slide for me was the slide that you showed on disparities in income inequality across countries.
Mm.
That to me was probably the most striking slide there
Mhm.
because it really highlighted the extent of these within country inequalities. And as you
Mhm.
say, within the political context we live in at the moment, I mean, you alluded to this at the beginning. I mean, I think one of the things that really strikes us in WAHEN is some of the pushback that we're seeing with relation to the agenda regarding equity in higher education. Obviously, we can talk very much about one particular country, which we're all aware of, but which has a very important aspect in terms of shaping the global dialogue. But it's then happening in other countries as well. And I think that particularly worries us in our area of work. I mean, with particularly regards to equity and access initiatives in the area, is there anything you've picked up on in your research and your data gathering with regards to the state of play, if you like, with regards to the equity and equitable access agenda across the world at the moment? Is it something that you've picked up on, the state of that agenda?
Absolutely. And the economic inequality may be the one that, in the long run, maybe not
Mm,
even the most important one. In economic inequality, you can always address through
mm,
redistribution. You can have
mm,
tax system that take money from the rich, give it to the poor. You can sort
mm,
of mediate the consequences of economic inequality.
mm,
But the bigger issue is the social participation. I think in
mm,
our societies, it's increasingly harder to actually,
mm,
play a meaningful role in
mm,
your society, in your political system without a really
mm,
good education.
mm,
Information becomes more complex to
mm,
navigate. And
mm,
that is the part where redistribution doesn't work.
mm,
Money doesn't equalize those things. If you do
mm,
not have the skills, you simply are limited in access
mm,
to resources, to political
mm,
efficacy,
mm,
all of that. And I think that's the bigger price that we will pay for inequalities in education early on.
mm,
And I
mm.
don't think it's just a story, for higher education. I
No,
think the
no.
big factor really starts much earlier. But I think
Mm.
the social and civic polarization probably leads to bigger issues for our societies than simply just the economic uh, inequality.
I agree. And then I know that you have quite a rich, expanding level of data, which I've looked at in my work before, which looks at the relationship between broader concepts of well-being and participation
Mhm.
and civic participation and relation of those things to
Mhm.
inequality and participation as well. And those broader benefits, if you like, of educational participation are ones as well, which I think are not such crowded out by the economic question, but need to be crowded back into that question when we look at the impact of inequalities, as you say, not both in higher but in tertiary and further education as well. There's a slight point from Jimmy there in the chat about figures on higher income nations, but that of course reflects the nature of the OECD to an extent, doesn't it? And I do think that we do have some data on developing nations, Jimmy, and I'll be talking later on about new research we're undertaking that will pull together some of that data as well on lower income nations. But I think as well, going back to that point then about the broader benefits of higher education and the impact of inequalities in access and success in those areas. Again, do you have any further thoughts on the broader data you put together? What does some of that data show? Because I know your data on civic participation efficiency is very rich and expanding. I think it's really important stuff as well.
Yeah, first of all, on your point on developing countries, again, we do not have so much on emerging and developing economies, but where we do have data, the picture is actually often worse than in OECD
Exactly.
countries.
Exactly.
You
Yeah.
have actually those who have, advanced degrees having an even bigger gain.
Mm,
You look to countries like Brazil. I mean,
mm,
and in a sense, I think this is not just a phenomenon in our income countries. But we do have actually really good data on civic social participation
mm,
health,
mm,
and
mm,
often the relationships are even stronger than with money.
mm, mm,
You can see
mm,
life starting with life satisfaction, whether you're happy with
mm,
your life, that is
mm,
often mediated through the work that you do.
mm,
The health of people,
mm,
people with low skills often end up in the unhealthy jobs. They maybe have less healthy behavior,
mm,
civic participation, political efficacy. Those at the high end of the skill distribution see themselves as actors in
mm,
society. Those at the low
mm,
end do not believe they
mm,
can have any meaningful influence. So I think all of those outcomes play an
mm,
incredibly important role. And once again, personally, I'm less, if I think about the long-term, future of our societies, I think we will always find ways to deal with the economic inequality if we want.
mm,
That's a matter
mm,
of, societies and tax systems. But I think the social and civic participation, the exclusion that we will see for people
mm,
who do not get the foundations, that is something that we will not address with any kind of economic or broad brush means. That is
mm,
only the only route to that is, to help give people, better chances to develop themselves, either initially in life or later. No. We
mm.
didn't even touch on the topic of, upskilling and reskilling. What are you
No,
doing to do for people
no.
at later stages in life is equally
Exactly.
important.
We didn't touch on a lifelong learning agenda, did we, today? Which, of course, embraces to an extent higher education, embraces more forms of different forms of provision and provider as well, and that the whole question of what tertiary education means. We approach the end of our conversation, Andreas, but I've got one final question for you in our conversation. Obviously, we are launching our global communities today, and the idea is to create an ongoing conversation, exchange of knowledge and information with regards to to data and research on higher education. Well, what do you think the focus should be? What contribution could this kind of idea of a global community through WAHEN looking at data and research on inequalities in access and success make? What sort of themes do you think we should really think about here?
I think what would be so important to get, examples of success at whatever level, could be local, could be regional. But I do think we need to have a better understanding of successful approaches, how you address the things with, funding regimes, with, student support systems, with how you regulate access. And I think we have a rough understanding how this works at national levels, but the most interesting experiences usually happen at very granular levels. And I think if we could get a better understanding of what works in what context, that could be very inspiring for public policy in the long run now.
Thank you, Andreas. Thank you. We are out of time now. I know that you have to go on to another event, and I know there are some questions, but as I said before, please do get those questions in early because we have to keep the time here. Andreas, thank you very much. Thank you for giving the presentation. Thank you for your interest and support in WAHEN, and thank you for answering the questions that I posed in the discussion so well. So we will thank you in a conventional way if we're in a room. I'm sure those around the world are applauding your contribution as well today. So, and please, let's try and work together in the future as well if we can. So thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So we'll move on to our second presentation now. So what we're going to do now is Kristina's going to speak, and I will give a little bit of background regarding to a new research project that we're doing here at WAHEN, and then we'll open up for questions for Kristina and I. So we'll form a little panel together. So before that, let's just so it's great to introduce Kristina. Kristina works at the German Centre for Higher Education Research and Science Studies. Her work has focused on the evaluation of policy and practice in higher education, covering a range of topics, from student dropout to student fees and the quality of higher education provision. She's now project leader of the really excellent international project EUROSTUDENT, which collects data on the social and economic conditions of higher education in many countries in the European higher education area. So I'm sure she'll tell us about EUROSTUDENT. I'm sure that many of us in the call today know about EUROSTUDENT. If you don't, I would really encourage you, if you're interested in data in this area, to get onto EUROSTUDENT's website, look at the range of data that they have. It's not just 1 year, it goes back quite a long time now. And it's a wonderful source of both data, but also, I think, as Andreas alluded to, examples as well, I think, within there of progress and practice. So, no, little less from me. And Kristina, over to you.
Thank you, Graeme, and thank you for the opportunity to present EUROSTUDENT here today. Let me share. We practiced, but I think there might be some challenges again. It's a bit slow. I hope it's coming.
We can see it now, but we can't see it. Yeah, we have it now in presentation mode. Yeah, I think we're all good now.
Okay, perfect. So we heard from Andreas Schleicher that indeed widening access to higher education has been what we could observe over the past decades. But if you actually ask who gets in and who stays in and who thrives and succeeds in higher education, the answer still depends heavily on parents' background. One of the clearest indicators we find in EUROSTUDENT across systems is whether students' parents hold a tertiary degree. In EUROSTUDENT, we've been looking at this, like you've said, over more than 20 years. And not just this, but the broader social dimension of higher education in general. What I will try to show today with the EUROSTUDENT data is not just who gets into higher education, but also how the student background continues to shape the experience and the path throughout the degree. A quick background on EUROSTUDENT, so you know where the data is coming from. We have been collecting data on the social dimension of European higher education through student surveys, like I said, for more than 20 years. By we, I mean our EUROSTUDENT consortium, which is made up of the 6 member organizations, my own, the German Center for Higher Education Research and Science Studies, and partners at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Vienna, at ResearchNet in the Netherlands, Praxis in Estonia, the Malta Further and Higher Education Authority, and the Swiss Federal Statistical Office. In the current EUROSTUDENT round, which we began in the September of last year, we have 26 countries participating, which you can see here on the map. This is one of the later rounds where we've managed to increase the number from the beginning 8 countries in the early 2000s now to a larger initiative in rounds 8 and 9. The data I will be showing you as we have just started the 9th round will all stem from the 8th round of the project. Moving from this background now into findings, starting with access to higher education. I want to focus throughout this presentation on one group that is central to discussions of equity in many countries, namely students from lower educational backgrounds. There are other important dimensions of inequality that vary by country, which may be different in Europe than in other parts of the world. But we see across the countries we observe that this group, students from lower education backgrounds, really provide a good insight into the structural barriers across Europe. In EUROSTUDENT, we define this group based on the educational attainment of parents. So we distinguish specifically between students whose parents hold a highest degree at ISCED levels 0 to 4, so non-tertiary as low educational background, and those whose parents have at least one tertiary degree between them at level 6 to 8, as those with high educational background, so having attended a university or other higher education institution. Across countries, we see that there is a wide variation. On the left side of the graph, in countries like Portugal, Croatia, Slovakia, Romania, Poland, half or more than half of students come from non-tertiary backgrounds, whereas on the right side, France, Netherlands, Finland, Norway, Denmark, this applies to only about a third. So that already shows some variation across Europe. But absolute numbers like this alone don't tell us yet how equitable access is. So what we have done to look at this is compare it against the expected pattern we would see based on the population. In this scatter plot, I don't want to get into the details. If you want more, we can do it in the question session. But what's important to see here is that almost all countries are below the diagonal. And this means in these countries, fewer students from lower educational backgrounds are enrolled than you would expect. And you can see the underrepresentation is widespread. There are a few exceptions, notably here Ireland and Sweden, where the students are either perfectly represented or even overrepresented. And Austria, Iceland, Lithuania, Portugal, and Slovakia also we see comparatively high alignment. But on average, the share of students from non-tertiary backgrounds, fathers in this case, compared to what you would expect is 16% lower. When we look at how these students get into higher education, we see differences in both access routes and study progression according to educational background. Here we have the example of alternative access routes into higher education, which are defined as students entering either without the standard qualification in a country, so baccalaureate, abitur, matura, or having obtained this standard qualification through adult evening education, for example. We see in all countries the blue triangles above, almost all countries, the blue triangles above the black, so that these routes are more commonly used by students from lower educational backgrounds. We also see different progression patterns of these students without tertiary education background going into postgraduate master programs. This figure shows students who have a gap of 2 years or more between bachelor and master programs. On average, this applies to 28% of students, but almost everywhere, again, we see differences with students without tertiary educational background, the blue triangles, more often taking such long breaks between bachelor and master. I said I don't only want to look at access, but also what happens once students are in. We don't have success indicators in the sense that we know dropout rates or something like this in EUROSTUDENT, but we have a wide range of indicators and data on the study conditions students experience once they are in. One major factor shaping the study conditions of students is, we already heard about it from Andreas Schleicher, is financing. We are able to take a bit more granular look than on the slides we've seen, which looked at the funding systems in place. Here we can see how students' personal budgets are actually shaped. Excuse me. And if we look at the average here, we see 40% of income of students comes from family or partner, 41% from self-earned incomes, and only 12% from national public student support. Other could be loans, could be savings. It's not a huge factor in any of the countries we look at, but it's striking that private sources, so family partner or self-earned income by the students on average make up 80%. But, and this fits quite well with what we've seen from Andreas Schleicher, there are countries where national public student support indeed makes up a large share of student incomes. He mentioned Denmark. Indeed, 45% of students' income comes from national public student support. In Sweden, half. Also in Finland and Norway, it's a significant part of their budget. But in the others, it's either the self-earned income, which is a big part. So in Iceland, 64% of students' income is self-earned. Here are some where it's like half, Malta, more than half, and some countries where it's clearly the family supporting the student. In Georgia, Portugal, Azerbaijan, 60% up to 75% comes from the family. So students really depend on family wealth or on working during studies. This is important because this also means that students from less well-off families are much more likely to have to work while studying, which raises the question about time, energy, thinking capacity they have left for their studies. We see the share of students who indicate they have to work in order to be a student, depending on the parental financial status. Students whose parents are not at all well off, in gray, you see, are higher, so more often indicate this to be the case than those with very well off parents who need to work to a much lesser extent. When thinking about students working, this isn't just the classic student job like working in a restaurant, but we've seen that these students are older, come in alternatively, take breaks between bachelor and master. These can be real jobs, so to say, that they might be studying alongside a job, pursuing a master's for their job. So you can imagine it's a full schedule. We also see that they're able accordingly to spend less time on their studies and more on work if it exceeds a certain amount. Going a bit beyond financial resources, we also look at practical access to study materials. Here, specifically computer or other device and a sufficient internet connection. It seems like these might be problems that should already be solved in Europe, but we can see this isn't always the case for everyone. And again, we see differences depending on students' educational background. Computer, laptop, tablet, when needed, available indeed is the case, as you can see, for 99, 98, 97% of students in these countries. But there are countries, Romania, Azerbaijan, Georgia, where this is only the case for 75 to 80%. And if there are issues, they are worse for students from lower educational background. The same with internet, which isn't as high as having a device everywhere. So it's a bit lower in general, but often in the 90s or high 80s. But there are still countries where students report not always having a sufficient internet connection when needed. And again, particularly in these countries, we tend to see differences between students from low and high educational backgrounds. There's a lot more I could show you because this the differences, the different study experiences for students from low and high educational background go through a lot of our data. I just took out some key points here to show you. I mentioned the students are more likely to be older and thus have additional responsibilities. So their own family, a real job, which also is related to the fact that we see them pursuing exchange programs, international mobility, studying abroad to a much lesser extent, also indicating that this is due to financial and family reasons. Interesting is that similarly to the alternative access I showed, we see these students also being more likely to study in part-time or in short cycle programs and preferring flexible study formats. So online learning, distance learning, also to balance their work or family commitments. Financially, there is we already saw the relation between the need to work and parental financial status. It's also linked, unsurprisingly, to the experience of financial difficulties. So students from less well-off families much more often report currently experiencing financial difficulties, and also non-trivial report that they wouldn't be able to manage an unexpected expense of 60% of the median income. So a very concrete example is if the laptop breaks, they can't replace it and no one from their family could replace it. We see a lot of students saying they couldn't immediately replace a laptop, but those with better off parents say, but someone else would pay this for me. And then you can continue your studies if you don't have access to a laptop or something else, card to get to a higher education institution, whatever. This could mean the end of studies. So we see that the experience is shaped by a lot of challenges that these students might face in completing higher education. So what could be done in policy-wise to support these students? A clear finding we see is that flexible access and entry routes clearly help. So recognizing prior learning or prior work experience makes it easier for disadvantaged students to access higher education. We saw that this indeed works. The fact that they don't have the regular standard entry qualification doesn't reflect a lack of ability, but a different trajectory. So flexible entry routes make it possible to enter the system from different paths of life. Once these students are enrolled, flexible study options help balancing the often different life situation, and similar to what Andreas Schleicher said, a persistent issue that remains is sustainable funding. We've saw now that private sources mostly dominate, and this, of course, makes the dependency on family background stronger. Yeah, this on the topics of access and success, some things we could use as the basis for discussion. If you want to see more, Graeme mentioned it, please visit our website. We have a lot of topics on the social dimension covering basically the entire student life cycle. We have some topical modules looking now at one that's also very interesting, mental health and well-being, as well as discrimination, COVID-19 and digitalization. And you can find everything on EUROSTUDENT EU. Yeah, just our reports, and also access the data itself if you want. So we have a database of aggregate indicators, or you can, if you want to look deeper, apply for the scientific use file. Thank you.
Fantastic, Kristina. Thank you very much. And proving, as I said earlier on, the rich nature of the EUROSTUDENT knowledge base there, and also, of course, pointing in a complementary way to some of the themes that Andreas opened us up with earlier on in the session today, particularly with regards to flexibility, different age of learners, types of provision as well, also the issue on working as well. I think very important. All those, I think, are really important topics to take forward. Digitisation as well, that's one I'd like to explore as well a bit further. And I'd encourage you as well, again, as I said before, to get your questions in the chat. Don't run out of time and be shy and put them at the end. If you've got questions, put them out there. I'm going to talk a little bit now about some new research that we're taking forward here at WAHEN, which bases on some early research we did 8 or 9 years ago, Then Kristina will come back, and Kristina and I will take any questions we have together. So I'm going to try and look and share in my slides now if possible. See if that works. Okay, so during the Global Access Map 2, talking now to say about a new piece of research we're taking forward at WAHEN, which is based on an earlier piece of research. So those of you may have heard us speak before at WAHEN or WAHED, referring to a piece of work that we did around 9 years ago now called Charting Equity in Higher Education, or Drawing the Global Access Map. I think what was touched upon before, again in the questions, was data from different types of country. We've seen today that EUROSTUDENT, because they focuses very much in the European education area. The work from Andreas, OECD, focuses, of course, on OECD members, even though I'm sure both colleagues have a good knowledge of what's happening across the world. We came to this piece of research, as I say, just before we launched World Access to Education Day, probably around 10 years ago now, around the idea of how can one bring together the available data from sources across the world to try a truly global perspective on who participates in higher education by social background. And thus we produced this report, Charting Equity in Higher Education, called Drawing a Global Access Map, published alongside two colleagues of mine back in 2017. The aim of this piece of work was to map higher education participation by social background across the world. Using data then, the data we accumulate as the basis for World Access to Education Day, or WAHED, which we delivered and tried to convene for 5 years, and WAHEN as well. Understanding about the importance of data as a basis for advocacy, as a basis for discussion, a basis for change. I think part of the argument, I'm not sure that's one that how much we can revisit now, was that there was huge gaps in the data available on this issue of who participates in higher education and from what background, and how they succeed and progress in different parts of the world, and how we can improve the quality of that data, but also understand why it's not being collected or disseminated as it could be. How do we do the report? 9 years ago, 9 years ago now, we examined international agencies' existing data. We looked at EUROSTUDENT data, actually. We looked at OECD data. Both colleagues have spoken today, alongside data from the World Bank and various other sources as well. We would take a survey of experts 9 years ago. We did some case studies looking at how data was collected in 6 different countries to understand how it was collected within country. I think it's quite important. We look at 2 examples today of information, particularly EUROSTUDENT, especially. We see examples of data from a particular survey. We were interested, as well as the survey approaches, how data was collected by individual countries for their own particular different systems of administration in higher education, or perhaps broader surveys undertaken on social and economic life, but census data, for instance, which includes questions on higher education. We understand how that data is collected, the various ways of collecting information, either uniform surveys delivered in similar ways across countries, such as EUROSTUDENT, or indeed by individual countries collecting data for their own higher education systems at points of admission, or points of admission to higher education, or through higher education, or indeed, as I say, through broader surveys which countries may undertake, looking at features of that society, education being one of them. And those are kind of the things we tried to get to a little bit with our 6 different case studies. What are our key findings? I think an important finding is the pervasive nature of inequalities in access to higher education. We take a pause usually at that point to think a little bit about higher education across the world. We think about education across the world, we think of what binds us together as systems, as universities, as academics, as subject areas. We focus very much on the production of knowledge, perhaps the opening of opportunity to learn. We must also acknowledge what binds us together is actually inequality. We think the Global Access Map did a reasonable job at bringing that argument forward. The data available has important limitations. We did point to the fact in the report 8 or 9 years ago that there was limitations in how data was, not just how it's collected, what was collected, and how it was disseminated as well. There's various parts of the journey when one comes to understanding anything about higher education system. It's not just collecting information, it's regularity of that collection. It's the dissemination of that information as well. Comparisons across countries are important but difficult. Comparisons are EUROSTUDENT is an excellent example, and the OECD data of good comparisons. But it's not always possible across all parts of the world, as things are collected differently in different ways. Access means more than entry and participation. Again, I think one of the strengths of what we're seeing today is we also have information not just on who enters higher education, but who succeeds, what happens afterwards. We know that particularly for students from low income and other backgrounds where students may experience greater challenges, students may not always complete their studies or go on to achieve their individual potential. And access without success, it's been argued, is not access at all. And finally, political will and resourcing shapes data collection. It's worth taking a step back and thinking about those two questions. Political decisions will shape what information is collected, presented and disseminated. Perhaps even more so than when we did this research, as I say, 8 or 9 years ago. It's been more perhaps prominent in civil and public society, the relationship between information and political decision making. And finally, the question of resourcing. If we want to improve data collection, it costs money. In an environment where, as we pointed out by both presenters so far, the data, the income and finances is restricted with regards to higher education systems. How much can we devote to collecting better data? This is our map that was in our original report. It shows, and we'll see in a moment, that in 90% of the countries in the world where we can find data, that we only collected in 90%, in every country we found data, there was some evidence of inequalities in higher education participation by social background, be that social economic background and gender, other forms of participation. In a few countries where there's no data, when 10% couldn't find data, everywhere we could find data, there was evidence of inequality by social background. So you see, in 90% of countries in the world, all where we had data, inequality exists by student background. So, where are we now? Oh, and finally, of course, the final slide from that study was we also looked in the study at a number of survey countries where data are collected, and by what? What forms? Because, of course, we're digging in a little bit to the kinds of measures of social background that exist. And we found that gender was the most common way in which data was collected by social background, followed by socio-economic background, rurality, age, refugee status, disability, etc. What also brings home, though, of course, this question of social background is a complex one. We see, obviously, in the real world, people's identities coalesce together. We're not just people with gender, we are people with different social backgrounds, people with different geographies, people with different ages. So the combination of background characteristics makes a very complex situation where we're trying to understand, measure, and impact upon inequalities in access and success in higher education. So we're now launching a new report, 9 years on, called Drawing the Global Access Map 2. Essentially a follow-up study to what we did in 2017 to look at how the situation may have developed and changed regards to the availability, collection, dissemination of data on higher education participation by social background and what that data shows. There's a pause on it, why that work is important. As we alluded to today, the work we're engaged in, and most of us in this seminar will be engaged in some regard, but I would imagine, is under challenge from populists, right? There is those who question, they would argue justifiably, the rationale for the work that we're doing when it comes to extending access and equity in higher education, and the resource and finance put behind that. There's a challenge, a debate challenge. It perhaps wasn't here 8 or 9 years ago. Economically, we've seen already in our seminar today the challenge, not just around funding access or equity work, but broadly, how do we fund higher education in the 21st century? For those of us who want to make the argument for the importance of continuing to press on greater equity and access to success in higher education, we do need to make the case better. We hope joining the Global Access Map 2 will help us in that regard. What's the next steps then? We're taking this work forward now, this new study, looking to understand where progress has been made, what works, in a sense, as Andreas alluded to earlier on. Using the data we collect as the basis for our work in WAHEN. And this report has been supported by the Lumina Foundation in the US, and those who aren't familiar with the work of Lumina. So we're looking at how they have used data in a US context to inform the goals they've taken forward as an organisation. An example of the importance and relationship between data and action. That's what we believe is the basis of what we're doing here in WAHEN. How will we do it? And similarly to how we did in 2017, we will examine and collect existing data. We'll undertake a global survey, assess the state of data, and look at where and why progress exists. We're establishing recommendations for future action. So what's our timetable then? So our timetable is launching our research today. Our survey will go live in June 2025, and all of those who are part of the WAHEN network, all of those who we send information to regarding our initiatives and activities, will give an opportunity they wish to do to contribute to the survey. And encourage you, if you have thoughts on data or can point us to good examples of data being used and collected in your own particular context, please complete the survey. The more important, richer this study can be, the more impact we hope it can have. We'll take some expert consultation around the autumn time before launching the report on World Access to Higher Education Day at our hybrid conference, both physically, University of Western Cape in South Africa, and also online in 28th of October 2025. So please do engage if you can in our new research. But it throws me again some interesting questions about where we are, what's the state of play across the world, if you like, when it comes to inequalities and access and success in higher education by social background. I'll stop at that point, and I will stop the share, and I will pop back in to the chairing mode, and let's look and see what opportunity we have a discussion now for the rest of our session. So, Kristina, let's look over to the chat, see what we've got over there then. So we have a question from Dana there, our first question. I think it's probably to you really there, Kristina. She asked if you have data disaggregated for ethnicity. Dara pointed to, I think, as I mentioned in my session before, my presentation, intersectionality of factors of disadvantage and how that affects minoritized ethnic groups. She's quite interested then, Diana, if you have data disaggregated for ethnicities. Is that the case then, Kristina, in the research studio?
We do collect the birthplace of students' parents and the birthplace of the student themselves in the national surveys, but we, as the central analyzer, so to say, don't have it so that we know. But at national level, because indeed, depending on the country, this is a very relevant factor in determining students' access and experience in higher education. It is available. And we know we are able to separate out international students from ethnic background as well. So whether a student is basically a migrant who has been through the school system in the country that we're looking at, or has come to this country specifically for the purpose of higher education.
Adding to that question as well, I guess, Diana, from the point of view of the research we've undertaken, both for the original drawing the Global Access Map study and subsequently, we do find again when it comes to certain individual countries which are probably invested more resources and have advanced in terms of systems when it comes to data collection and this kind of disaggregation issue. So there are some countries, and we outlined them in the first study, where there is disaggregated data by ethnicity. But coming back to my earlier point, actually, I think the challenge is it's actually in some countries financial, but also, of course, cultural. It's actually not easy sometimes in certain contexts to collect detailed data on ethnicity. It's not the kind of thing that one collects in much detail. Kristina's nodding there. So it's important to think about globally, not just differences in the kind of resources that any system has to collect data, but the cultural differences as well. I think really interesting. Have you observed that, Kristina, in your experience?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the ethnicity question in Germany is not really possible to ask. And it's also difficult to come up with a question that would be applicable and relevant for all of Europe, because mostly in different countries, there are one or two ethnicities of interest, which aren't really widespread in others. So just the methodological aspect of actually the technical implementation of the survey becomes an issue.
So, and next question we have, Kristina, in the chat from Hannah. So Hannah asks, she wonders if distance to higher education or a learning centre for distance to adult learning, for instance, is a factor that you've looked at.
In fact, we have. We ask about commuting time students have to their higher education institution. I already saw the question in the chat and checked whether we have it readily available by social background. I couldn't find it right now. We know the average commuting time across our countries is 45 minutes one way, but there are very big differences within each country between students living at home and students living with on their own or in student accommodation. Student accommodation often, because they tend to be near or on campus, is like 10, 20 minutes, so really quickly. And some students living at home commute 60 minutes one way, so adding 2 hours, which is relevant because we know that students from lower educational backgrounds also more often tend to live at home for financial reasons and others. So it does give this indication. I could look into it more detailed if Hannah wants it. I think she has my contact address, so send me an email and I will look it up by educational background for you.
Thank you, Kristina. Just to add to that, actually, a different piece of work. We've just released a report here in England last week, and maybe Frances, if she's there, can put a link into the chat for this one, that looked at higher education participation by different types of place within England. We compared cities and villages and coastal areas, like I suggest on the coast. And we did find that those areas where there was less higher education provision, where universities were not present, even though there was a form of higher education provision, tended to have lower levels of HE participation. So we did find the presence of higher education in an area very important. And that was for participation by students from low-income backgrounds as well. Only in England, but again, adding again to the point Kristina made about commuting and travel. Our next question here is from Edith. So Edith's asking about data collected between different subject disciplines. So I wonder if inequalities are higher in certain subjects because of the nature of applying or learning, or even due to changing attitudes towards worthwhile subjects, perceived hierarchies. So Kristina, any thoughts on differences by subject?
Not off the top of my head, but also approximating it, something I do know and what we clearly see and have seen for several rounds is differences in level of education, which I mentioned, that we find students with lower education background tending more into short cycle and non-university settings, which already is correlated to some extent with the subjects on offer, and also by degree type, with less progression into postgraduate degrees and also long national degrees. And the long national degrees in most cases are something like medicine or law, which tend to be, I'm not going to say everywhere, let's say almost everywhere from what I remember, really seem to be favored by students with a high educational background, so whose parents have gone to university and maybe even studied this subject themselves. But this data is definitely available in our report and database. I just don't know exactly the disciplines. And it must be said, across countries, the value associated with different subjects also differs. So teacher training is an example, which in some countries is chosen. That actually I do know. Now I'm realizing that I'm saying it is actually chosen more often because it seems accessible and, you know, something students who might not have a high educational family background, they've been to school, they've seen teachers at work, so they know, okay, this is something, I know what happens, I can do this and go to university to become a teacher. Except in some countries where this is a very hard to get into subject with very high societal regard, there it turns. And it's, again, the higher educated students going into teacher training.
That point about hierarchies, I think, is an interesting one, isn't it, Kristina? And I think you point there to the fact that these hierarchies are not identical across countries, and policy can also shape hierarchies to an extent. It can shape provision and participation by funding and supporting different subject areas in different ways. In terms of the question around difference between subject disciplines, again, that's a question that again comes back to, I think, my answer before. Once you start to look for more granular data, be it different kinds of ethnic group or different sorts of discipline, and actually can roll us into the next question from Jimmy, where I think his next question in the chat is, will the new research, I'm presuming it implies to join the Global Access Map, take into account access to quality in higher education, or just access to any higher education? Now, again, there's a question of how we define quality higher education. We are aware that quality does differ. There's awareness that particularly in certain countries, say in parts of the global south in particular, there are some challenges with regards to the quality of provision in the higher education sectors. But however, how we can map that against provision to an extent, but it would take individual country studies to really pull that out. To do it on a global level would be a bigger project than we've got the capacity to do, if you have the data to do, in our study that we're launching this year. But you can do it in certain contexts where you have the data in certain countries. And by the way, not all those countries where that data is possibly available are more well-resourced countries. However, they do tend to be so. That's my earlier point, that developing sophisticated, comprehensive data systems is an ongoing, costly exercise. And you're faced with policy choices. If I have X amount of money, do I spend it on a comprehensive costly data system, or do I spend it on sort of scholarships, or I just spend it on new universities, etc., etc.? So you're faced with these kind of policy questions, if you like, when it comes to it. But it is a very important question as well. So what further questions we have? So Diana comes back again. I think if you look at Diana's question, I think you're alluding to differences in participation, not by subject, but by kind of ISCED levels, which means, across bachelor's level, doctoral level, and of course at that kind of short cycle level. So have you any comments on that question from Diana about, I think you mentioned it a little before, Kristina, anything to add on the point of how do we differentiate across points within what we describe as the higher education system broadly?
I hope I'm understanding it correctly when I think this is indeed goes to what I was saying earlier, that within the higher education system, there's a certain stratification that we indeed observe and can look at in more detail as well. I just didn't show it for this presentation where we had all of them, but it would be possible to look at more specifically, except we could. I'm just looking at the comment, except doctoral level, because we don't have doctoral students in our survey.
I think it's an important question. I think, again, it shows the strength of EUROSTUDENT that you're able to do that, because I think that, again, back to the point regarding the collection of data in different countries. Even when in the previous work we've undertaken under the WAHEN and WAHEN banner has looked at not just differences in higher education data collection across countries, but differences in policy approaches across countries as well. And when it comes to what you did most describe as postgraduate level, then that kind of data, even in the countries that collect the best data, if you put the word best, aren't really looking at that by social background. They are undergraduate level, so it's get if you are 4, 5, 6, but not it's get 7 or 8. So you're not seeing that differentiation of data by. If we go to my table before, we found most differentiation and collection by different forms of social background happens at levels 5, 6, 7, not in your question there. So 5 and 6, not actually at the master's and doctoral level as well. Okay. I have a further question for you, actually, Kristina, just to when you presented before. I was really fascinated by your slide on digitization in higher education and differences there by social background. Tell us a little more about, you mentioned at the end of the slide, that sort of the themes you're looking at. How are you hoping to develop that digitization and participation theme? Because it's increasingly important, isn't it, in higher education now, the way in which we learn and teach and the digitization of that learning and teaching? Are we opening up new opportunities? Or are we creating new divisions? Can you tell us more about what you're doing in your student area, Babs?
It's another tricky topic, if you will, where we have had issues actually coming up with questions that are applicable to, as you've seen, we have from Norway to Azerbaijan and Georgia, and like what questions do you ask to we have more than 200,000 students in our sample that make sense to everyone's situation. And we did a lot of research and ended up with, let's say, the basics, but I mean, we've seen that we still got interesting results. It was actually a topical module in EUROSTUDENT 8. So we have the core topics. I've shown that we've been surveying for 20 years, but since the last round, also in-depth topics. So digitalization was one of them, also mental health, effects of COVID and discrimination. So we aren't continuing this. We choose it together with our ministries and researchers who give input on what the hot topics are. And for EUROSTUDENT 9, they've decided to focus on mental health and financial deprivation. So we will be looking more into the effects. I've shown some financial difficulties. We will be able to differentiate further what this means. Can they afford a balanced diet? Can they afford clothes? Do they have a social life? As for digitalization in EUROSTUDENT 9, we will scale it back a bit and only, I mean, this is newly introduced since, COVID, whether they are studying online or live or face-to-face, and to what extent, so we can use this as a differentiating factor. But we did see that if you count online learning as a flexible mode of higher education provision, that indeed this is successful in reaching certain students, and interestingly also that students have seemed to sort it themselves kind of well into what's on offer, and everyone was more or less happy with the extent of online versus face-to-face. But this means, of course, we only have those who are in and not those who couldn't find anything near them or wherever that fits them.
No, I think it's a very interesting area. I mean, particularly as we come to see artificial intelligence playing a bigger role, if you like, in higher education, teaching and learning. And particularly, I know it's difficult to frame these questions internationally, but I do think it's really important that you're attempting to do this and trying to understand whether these divisions, whether there are new divisions forming with regards to such applications and access to them, or whether indeed they are providing different small opportunities. So I think it's an increasingly important area, and I think I recognise the fact that it's difficult to do, but I'm really glad that you're taking it forward. Okay, we're approaching the end of the seminar now. I know Andreas has had to move on. I guess any final points you'd like to leave us with, Kristina, from the presentation? Any final thoughts for yourself? I posed a question to Andreas at the end of the last session. What do you believe that a global community looking at inequalities in access and participation and the data available could contribute? What sort of big themes that such a community could look at from your perspective?
What's quite striking, I think, when looking at our data is, I mean, of course I picked them, but it's not the only slides that show that the challenges across many countries, although they vary in the extent, the differences between groups seem to remain. Whether you fund a lot or you fund a little, you have young students, you have old students. There are very similar challenges facing all of the European countries, and we've heard from you. I mean, you can't be more encompassing than what you've said. Like in all of the countries you've looked at, you've found that the background of students plays a role. So what I think would be valuable for a community, exactly like you've said, is to exchange about measures, what we can do about it. We just had a workshop ourselves, a EUROSTUDENT internal one, with our participating countries' ministries on cross-sectoral collaboration, because many of these issues are also something that cannot be solved by higher education policymakers alone. They relate to maybe labor ministries who set the regulations for working alongside studies, students with disability or other disadvantages may fall under the responsibility of health ministry. Of course, a lot of these inequalities don't pop up when a student enters higher education, but have been in the school system the entire time. So the whole sectoral integration is important. And we really had a good discussions and presentations on that. And I think, or the feedback we also got is learning about what others are doing, be it big. We heard about really great national, all government, all level plans where people got jealous because, of course, they require a lot of funding. And just, I don't want to call it small, but maybe more approachable, direct initiatives of implementing a stakeholder network within a country, or I mean, you are doing it globally, to exactly exchange about these issues, just to ensure the exchange of knowledge and the development of strategies. Because I think exactly like you're doing it, the collection of data and the fostering of exchange is needed across within country and across countries to really be able to learn from each other.
Thank you, Kristina. And thank you again for participating today. I'm sure we'll be thanking you again in the conventional fashion if we're all together in one room. But thank you very much. And thank you for your points at the end. I think that collaborative point is so important and so much at the heart of what we're trying to do with WAHEN now. I look forward again to continued collaboration with EUROSTUDENT and your colleagues. So if Francis could share the slides at the end now. So I guess just two further points to make before we conclude today. If we can see that, I think I can see that all there, Francis. We do have another event coming up very soon, only next week. In collaboration with our colleagues at the Centre for Global Higher Education and Scope at the University of Oxford. It's a face-to-face event and an online event. Access and Geopolitics, Next Steps in Tackling the Equity Crisis in Global Higher Education. So a broad range of papers, over 30 presenters there in 4 different streams. Focus, and our keynote speakers there, drawn again from Australia. Jamil Salmi, some will know Jamil, who was once head of tertiary education at the World Bank, now a renowned expert on education equity issues, and worked closely with Jamil for some time now. That conference will not just look at data, but also look at policies and practices, both within and across countries, designed to address inequalities in access and access in higher education, but also trying to place them in this broader geopolitical context and the challenges we face across the world now in pushing forward issues of equity, diversity and inclusion. We also have, coming up, our next global community event is turning our attention very much to what has been discussed today, not just the data, but what are we actually doing about some of these problems, what activities are being undertaken across the world. We will share examples of practice on activities and initiatives supporting low-income, first-generation and marginalised students to achieve their potential, best practice from across the world. We have speakers already confirmed for South Africa and from the UK. We'll be adding 2 or 3 more countries. Oh, sorry, Chile. Sorry, Chile, the UK, but also actually South Africa as well. So we'll be sharing at least, and probably 2 more countries as well. Examples of what's happening both at access and success. Examples of practice that universities, governments and others are taking forward. So again, moving from that issue of data to a global community, looking at practice and initiatives. Thank you for coming along to this first WAHEN Global Community Seminar. I look forward to your continued input to WAHEN. If you have any thoughts on WAHEN and our work, please do email us, please do get in touch. We'll be having another Inequalities in Access and Success Data seminar workshop later in the year. Then from 26 onwards, we're really focusing on that community aspect as we open up membership to WAHEN to organisations across the world to be sustainable and take our work forward. Thank you very much. It's time to finish now. Enjoy the rest of your days wherever you are. I look forward to seeing you all again, hopefully either next week on the 3rd of June or hopefully in July. Thank you very much.